The flight attendant looked at my sister like she was trash, demanding she move to the back of the plane. But when Captain Rodriguez saw the tattoo on Vera's back, everything changed in ways none of us could have predicted. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. I'm Paige Caldwell, and what happened on Flight 847 that Tuesday morning still gives me chills. My sister Vera had just buckled her seatbelt in first class when this blonde flight attendant marched over with the kind of look that could freeze fire. She stood there, arms crossed, staring down at my little sister like she'd caught her stealing from the collection plate at church. Now you need to understand something about Vera. At 32, she's got this quiet strength that most people miss completely. She's the kind of person who orders her coffee with a simple "thank you" and tips the barista even when she's counting every dollar. That morning she wore a faded navy hoodie and jeans with holes in the knees, not because she couldn't afford better, but because those clothes felt safe, comfortable, like armor against a world that had forgotten how to see her. I'm 3 years older than Vera, and I've spent my entire adult life building a successful marketing firm in Boston. I wear power suits and negotiate million-dollar contracts before lunch, but sitting next to my sister that day, I felt completely powerless watching what was about to unfold. The flight attendant's name tag read Bryn, and she had that particular brand of artificial smile that customer service people perfect when they think they're dealing with someone beneath them. Behind her stood Captain Miguel Rodriguez, a man in his late 40s whose uniform carried the weight of authority and whose eyes held the unmistakable recognition of someone who understood sacrifice. But none of us knew that yet. All we knew was that Bryn Whitmore was about to turn our peaceful flight into something that would change how my sister saw herself forever. Vera sat by the window, her trained eyes automatically noting the emergency exits, her shoulders slightly hunched. In that protective posture she'd developed since coming home from her deployments, she had no idea that in the next few minutes the tattoo hidden beneath her hoodie would reveal a connection that would shake everyone on that plane. The other first-class passengers were already settling in around us. A businessman typing furiously on his laptop, an elderly couple sharing a crossword puzzle, a mother entertaining her toddler with quiet songs, normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that they were about to witness something extraordinary. I reached over and squeezed Vera's hand, feeling the calluses from years of training, the slight tremor that never quite left her fingers since Afghanistan. She squeezed back with that familiar strength, and I thought we were just two sisters heading home to Boston for a long overdue vacation. I was wrong about everything. Flight 847 was supposed to be simple. San Diego to Boston, nonstop, with my sister finally getting the break she deserved after 8 years of service that nearly broke her spirit. I'd booked us coach originally, just happy to have Vera agreeing to take her first real vacation since coming home from Afghanistan 2 years. But 3 days before our departure, Vera showed up at my apartment with that stubborn look I recognized from our childhood. She handed me a new boarding pass printed on her home computer. First-class seats 3A and 3B circled in red pen. "You sure about this upgrade?" "That money could have paid for your therapy sessions next month," I said, knowing how tight her budget was on veteran disability payments. Vera shook her head with the kind of finality that ended arguments before they started. "You've given me everything, Paige. Let me give you something back for once." Those words hit me harder than she intended. For 2 years, I'd watched my fearless little sister transform from the confident woman who used to drag me on hiking adventures to someone who flinched at car backfires and hadn't slept through a full night since her last deployment. She'd completed 6 months of intensive PTSD therapy, finally managing to talk about the things she'd seen and done overseas, but civilian life still felt like foreign territory. The morning of our flight, I picked her up from the small apartment she rented near the VA hospital. She emerged wearing her favorite navy hoodie, the one with Caldwell embroidered on the chest, and jeans so worn they were practically part of her skin. Her dark hair was pulled back in the same efficient ponytail she'd worn since boot camp, and she carried a single backpack that probably contained everything she owned that mattered. As we boarded the plane, I watched her unconscious habits kick in. She scanned every face in the terminal, noting exits and potential threats with the systematic precision of someone trained to survive in hostile territory. When we reached our seats, she immediately chose 3A, the window seat, positioning herself so she could see the entire cabin while keeping her back protected. "Old habits," she said quietly, catching my concerned look. The first-class cabin felt luxurious compared to our usual budget airline experiences. Wide leather seats, actual legroom, and flight attendants who smiled like they meant it. Or at least most of them did. I noticed Vera's shoulders relax slightly as she settled in, the first time I'd seen her truly comfortable in a public space since her discharge. She pulled out a paperback novel, some thriller about Navy SEALs that made me wince, but she caught my expression and smiled. "It's fiction, Paige. Helps me remember the good parts without the nightmares." That was progress. 6 months ago, anything military-related would have sent her spiraling. Now she was reclaiming pieces of her identity, slowly building bridges between the warrior she'd been and the woman she was becoming. This flight was supposed to be another step in that healing process, a chance for us to reconnect as sisters without the weight of her trauma hanging over every conversation. Neither of us realized we were about to discover that healing doesn't always happen quietly. The attack came disguised as customer service. Bryn Whitmore appeared beside our row like she'd materialized from thin air. Her plastic smile stretched tight across her face. She stood there for a long moment, studying Vera with the kind of calculated assessment that made my skin crawl. Her eyes traveled from my sister's worn sneakers to her faded hoodie, lingering on every detail that didn't match her expectations of a first-class passenger. "Excuse me, miss, but I'll need to see your boarding pass. There seems to be some confusion." Vera looked up from her book, immediately alert but keeping her voice steady. "It's right here." She reached into her jacket pocket and produced the boarding pass without any of the defensive energy I would have shown. Bryn examined it like she was studying evidence at a crime scene, turning it over in her manicured hands. "This says first class, but are you sure you didn't make a mistake? Coach is much more appropriate for your situation." The word situation hung in the air like poison gas. Around us, other passengers began turning their heads, drawn by the tension they could feel building. The businessman with the laptop glanced over his screen. The elderly couple stopped their crossword puzzle. Even the mother with the toddler shifted in her seat to get a better view. "What exactly do you mean by her situation?" I stood up, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned from years of corporate boardroom battles. Bryn's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. "Ma'am, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Some people just don't understand airplane etiquette." I watched Vera's hands begin to tremble, not from fear, but from something much more dangerous. It was the same controlled rage I'd seen when our father used to dismiss her dreams of military service, telling her that girls didn't belong in combat. The difference was that back then she'd fought back. Now, years of civilian conditioning had taught her to shrink away from confrontation. "Look," Bryn continued, her voice growing louder and more theatrical for the benefit of our audience, "I'm trying to save everyone here from an uncomfortable situation. These seats cost more than some people make in a month, and I think there's been some kind of mix-up." The businessman actually nodded in agreement. The elderly woman whispered something to her husband that made him frown in Vera's direction. I felt my sister beside me, slowly closing her book and preparing to surrender, without a fight. "You know what?" Vera's voice was barely above a whisper as she reached for her backpack. "It's fine, I can move to coach." That broke my heart. This was the same woman who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions the Navy could offer, who had risked her life countless times for strangers, and she was ready to accept humiliation rather than cause a scene. The military had trained her to follow orders and avoid unnecessary conflict, but civilian life had twisted those virtues into something that made her feel small. Bryn stepped back triumphantly, clearly expecting Vera to gather her things and slink away in shame. Everything changed in the space of a heartbeat. As Vera stood to retrieve her backpack from the overhead compartment, her hoodie rode up just enough to reveal a small section of black ink on her lower back. It wasn't much, maybe 2 inches of intricate design, but it was enough. The distinctive outline of a trident emerged from beneath the fabric, its sharp lines unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Captain Miguel Rodriguez had been walking through the cabin for his routine pre-flight check, probably planning to deliver the standard welcome announcement about weather conditions and flight time. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks 3 rows behind us, his eyes locked on that small glimpse of Vera's tattoo. I watched his entire demeanor shift in real time. The casual professionalism melted away, replaced by something that looked like recognition mixed with profound respect. His shoulders straightened, his jaw tightened, and he moved toward our row with the deliberate purpose of a man who had just realized he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. "Ma'am?" Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I couldn't help but notice that tattoo. Are you active military?" Vera froze with her hand still reaching for her bag, caught off guard by the sudden shift in attention. She turned slowly, her face guarded in the way it always became when strangers asked about her service. "Former Navy. Is there a problem, Captain?" The captain's response came immediately, with the kind of certainty that ended debates before they could start. "No problem at all, quite the opposite." Quite the... Bryn looked between them with growing confusion, her triumphant smile faltering as she realized the dynamic in first class had just completely reversed. "Captain, I was just explaining to this passenger that there's been some kind of seating error." Rodriguez turned toward Bryn with the kind of look that could freeze lava. "Ms. Whitmore, this passenger will remain in first class. In fact, I want you to ensure she has everything she needs for this flight. But Captain, she clearly doesn't belong. She clearly served our country with distinction." His words carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of command, presence that made arguing impossible. "That trident tattoo represents the Navy SEALs, one of the most elite fighting forces in the world. This woman has earned the right to sit wherever she damn well pleases." The silence that followed was deafening. Every passenger in first class had heard every word, and the shift in atmosphere was immediate and complete. The businessman who had been nodding in agreement with Bryn suddenly couldn't meet Vera's eyes. The elderly couple looked mortified by their earlier judgment. Even the toddler seemed to sense that something important was happening, going quiet in his mother's arms. Vera stood there still holding her backpack, looking like she couldn't quite process what had just happened. For 2 years she had been shrinking away from her identity as a veteran, letting other people's assumptions make her feel ashamed of her service. What happened next still makes my heart race whenever I think about it. Captain Rodriguez stepped closer to Vera, his voice dropping to a more personal tone despite the audience of first-class passengers hanging on every word. "If you don't mind me asking, what unit were you with?" Vera hesitated, the way she always did when people asked about her deployments. Most civilians wanted war stories they could never truly understand, but something in the captain's demeanor told her this was different. "SEAL Team 7. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan, mostly extraction and rescue operations." The captain's face went completely pale. "What years?" 2019 to 2022. "Why?" Rodriguez closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were filled with tears he wasn't bothering to hide. "My nephew Danny Martinez was with the 82nd Airborne, August 2021, Kandahar Province. His unit was pinned down by Taliban fighters for 18 hours. I watched my sister's entire body go rigid. She knew exactly what he was talking about before he even finished the sentence. Danny said a SEAL team came out of nowhere in the middle of the night." Rodriguez continued, his voice thick with emotion. 4 operators who moved like ghosts extracted his entire squad under heavy fire. He said the team leader was a woman who carried his wounded buddy Miller on her back for 2 miles through enemy territory. Vera's backpack slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the now silent cabin. "Miller had shrapnel in his leg, couldn't walk. We weren't leaving anyone behind. That was you." It wasn't a question. Rodriguez was staring at my sister like he was seeing a miracle. "You brought my nephew home." The entire first-class cabin erupted. I'm talking about spontaneous applause, people standing up, grown men wiping away tears. The businessman who had been judging her moments earlier was now on his feet clapping. The elderly woman was crying openly, reaching across the aisle to touch Vera's hand. But Rodriguez wasn't done. He grabbed the intercom microphone from Bryn's stunned hands and made an announcement that I'll never forget as long as I live. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. We have the honor of flying with a genuine American hero today. The woman in seat 3A served with Navy SEAL Team 7 and personally saved American soldiers under enemy fire in Afghanistan. I know my airline doesn't usually do this, but I think she deserves our recognition. The applause from the entire plane was thunderous. People in coach were standing up, craning their necks to see Vera, calling out thank yous and God bless yous that echoed through the aircraft. Vera just stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking like she couldn't quite believe this was real. For the first time since coming home, someone had seen her not as damaged goods or a charity case, but as the hero she'd always been. Bryn approached with tears in her own eyes, her voice barely a whisper. Ma'am, I owe you the deepest apology. I made assumptions I had no right to make. Vera looked at her with the grace that only comes from true strength. We all make mistakes. Just remember that heroes don't always look like what you expect. The rest of that flight became something I'll treasure for the rest of my life. What started as discrimination turned into the most beautiful celebration of service I've ever witnessed. Passengers kept approaching Vera throughout the flight, sharing their own military stories or simply saying thank you. A Vietnam veteran from coach made his way to first class just to shake her hand and tell her about his son who served in Iraq. A young mother explained that her husband was deployed overseas and thanked Vera for giving her hope that heroes like her were watching over him. But the most incredible transformation was happening in my sister. For the first time since coming home, I watched Vera's shoulders straighten with pride, instead of hunching defensively. She answered questions about her service with confidence rather than shame. When a teenage passenger asked what it was like being a female SEAL, Vera smiled and said, "It's like being any SEAL. You do whatever it takes to bring everyone home." Captain Rodriguez spent his break time sitting with us, sharing stories about his nephew Danny's recovery and how that rescue mission had given his entire family hope during the darkest period of their lives. Danny talks about that night constantly, he told Vera. He said the female team leader moved like she had superhuman strength, carrying Miller and covering the retreat at the same time. He never knew her name, but he said he'd recognize her anywhere. Vera laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months. Miller was terrified he was going to slow us down and get everyone killed. I had to convince him that leaving people behind isn't what we do. By the time we landed in Boston, Vera had collected a dozen business cards from passengers offering everything from job opportunities to speaking engagements. But more importantly, she had rediscovered something she'd lost when she came home from the war, the knowledge that her service mattered. As we waited for our luggage, Vera turned to me with tears in her eyes. "You know what, Paige? I think I'm ready to start living again, not just surviving. Welcome home, sis, really home this time." 3 months later, Vera started working with a veterans advocacy group in Boston, helping other returning service members navigate the challenges of civilian life. She speaks at high schools and colleges about military service, always emphasizing that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. She's even reconnected with some of her old SEAL teammates, rebuilding the brotherhood that had sustained her through the war. But the most important change is that she's stopped hiding who she is. The woman who once flinched at the mention of her military service now wears her SEAL t-shirts with pride. She's learned that true honor isn't about seeking recognition, it's about service itself. And sometimes, when we least expect it, the world reminds us that the people we pass judgment on might be the very ones who sacrificed everything for our freedom. That flight taught us all something vital. Behind every person is a story we don't know, and a little respect can reveal the heroes walking quietly among us.